gas and moves around the field, it can impact neighbors. It was very effective on killing weed seeds, and quite a few growers would use it before they would plant strawberries because it would kill the weed pathogens. But we don't really have that option anymore. A lot of growers are interested in black plastic as a way of managing weeds as well, and strawberries in this case. And black plastic works fairly well in annual systems where you plant your strawberries in the fall after the long day lengths induce runnering. So you plant them in the fall, they don't runner anymore. They just go through the fall and get exposed to short days and cool temperatures and induce flowers. The following spring, those flowers open and they set fruit. The fruit's harvested early in the spring, and then the plants are ripped out, and its cycle starts all over again. This is the annual system that you would see in California and Florida. And some growers are trying this black plastic system up north here in New York too. The challenges with that are that in the fall, when you plant your strawberries, oftentimes we don't have a very long period of cool, warm temperatures in the fall for those plants to get established and initiate flower buds. So they often don't do so well the following spring, even though it's a pretty good way of managing the weeds. The black plastic also has a big environmental impact too, and you don't really have a good way of getting rid of the plastic once it's in the ground. And in the second year, when the strawberries do try to produce runners, there's no place for those runners to root because the plastic's in the way, is you have to either cut them off or rip up the plastic. And that's a problem as well. And I did some calculations earlier, and strawberry growers use enough plastic each year to circle the earth 13 times. That's a lot of plastic that strawberry growers are using. So I'm not a real big proponent of black plastic on strawberries. Most of the growers in the Northeast use a matted row. And here they plant their strawberries in the springtime, about 18 inches apart down the row. The rows are about 4 feet apart. They plant into a essentially site that's prepared. It's a real nice seed bed. But if you look at this field, you can see there's a lot of opportunity there, a lot of niches for weeds to grow. There's not a lot of shading, the plants are small, and lots of open ground for weeds to grow. Typically, what happens is growers walk along and they clip off those first flowers to promote runnering. So the idea is the runners then will grow down the row and root and form a nice mat, hence the word matted row. But as you can see through all these pictures, there's bare ground throughout much of that first year. Growers irrigate those plants as they runner to establish, but oftentimes with all that bare ground, you get a lot of weeds. Be a real mess. And indeed, strawberry growers struggle endlessly with weeds, particularly under the matted row system. So a lot of people think, well, I can't have any weeds. I have to spend a lot of time out there making sure there are absolutely no weeds in my strawberries. And that could be a strategy to take, although that's very labor intensive. But we wanted to ask a few questions like, how much weed growth is acceptable? I mean, can you tolerate some weed growth? If so, how long can you have weeds in your field before you have to get them out? Weed a dead weed, are there times when weed growth can be tolerated, and there are times when it can't be tolerated. They're just too competitive with strawberry plants. So we thought before we really start tackling this whole problem of managing weeds, we ought to be able to answer some of these questions. We did an experiment, and this experiment was take a planting of strawberries, newly planted field, and let the weeds grow for certain periods of time and at certain times during that first year. So in this experiment, we had weeds growing for just the month of June, July, August, September, or no weeds at all throughout the entire year. Or we had 2-week periods, June and July, July and August, August, September, for 3-month periods, and for the entire season. And then we followed the yield of these strawberry plants for the next couple of years. Here's our plots. You can see some plots have weeds, some don't, depending on the month of the year. And here's our graph of some of our results. Over here on the left, you can see the X's indicate when weeds are present. This column here is runners. It indicates how many runners were formed after those weed treatments are present, and then the yield the following year. And what you can see in this first line is when you have weeds throughout the whole first year, you get very few runners and very low yield. You back off in the weeds, your yield goes up a little bit, back off a little bit more, your yield goes up a little bit. If you only have weeds during the month of June, your yields are higher. And of course, that sort of makes intuitive sense. But the thing that's really interesting, I think, is if you look at weeds in June or July or August, September, and look at the runners and look at the yield, you can see that early season weeds have a much larger impact on yield and runners, negative impact, than do late season weeds. In fact, weeds in September, there's some small impact on runner, maybe not much of an impact at all on yield. So weeds in the early part of the season are much more detrimental than weeds at the end of the season. And we can look at June and July weeds, a 2-month period, and look at our yield of 1,000 grams per plot, and look at weeds during a 2-month period at the end of the season down here, and our yield is 2.5 times as much, even though the time of weed pressure was exactly the same. We can do the same thing with 3 months of weed pressure. Early weeds, low yield, 3 months of weeds. At the end of later in the season, the yields are much higher. So it's pretty clear to us that those early season weeds in the strawberry field are the most critical and the ones we have to deal with the most. That's the bottom line here. So we also know that we don't have a lot of herbicides that work very well on strawberries. So the question is, can we use something else besides herbicides, like cultivation, to remove weeds early in the season when they're most problematic? We looked at a bunch of different cultivation tools to see what impact that would have on the strawberries and on the weeds in the planting year. This is a traditional instrument that's used to manage weeds. It's a rototiller or a multivator. It goes through and cultivates the weeds. I'm sure you've all seen this. The disadvantage of a multivator is it's very hard on soil structure, because when those tines come down into the soil, it compacts the soil 2 or 3 inches down in the ground. And then it also, on the upstroke, it brings up new weed seeds. So even though you work the weeds in, you're also bringing new weed seeds up, because you're working the soil down 3 or 4 inches, and it's hard in the structure. There's some other tools out there that some of the vegetable growers use that don't cultivate down so deeply and get weeds out right between the row. One's a finger weeder. You can see it here working on some long, and pulls the weeds out right around the plants. There are also these flex tine harrows, and they can be driven right over top of the plants, and these tines vibrate and they shake out the small weeds as you drive quickly over the field. So the strawberry plants can be right in the ground. You can drive right over here. Those things wiggle back and forth and vibrate. Strawberry plants stay intact, but any small weeds get vibrated out of the ground. And you can set those to different tensions and so forth, take out weeds of different sizes. This is a Reggie weeder. It goes in the back of a tractor. You sit in the back of it, and it has 2 rotating discs down here with tines on them that spin the weeds out, and the operator moves arms in and out to go around the plant. And you see here, these spin like this as you go around the plant, so you can get close to the plant, far away from the plant, close, and it only cultivates down about 1 inch or so. So the nice thing about this instrument is it does not compact the soil deeply. It doesn't bring up new weed seeds. It just spins the weeds out from around the plant. This instrument is a brush hoe. It's like a giant street sweeper. It has a couple of gaps in it that straddle the strawberry plants. And you can, in this case it's cabbage, but you straddle the rows and it just sweeps the weeds right out of the ground. It also creates a lot of dust. The dust settles back down in the ground, but that dust acts as a mulch and covers up weed seeds. So even though it only cultivates really between the rows, it also suppresses weeds between the plants as well. These are used a lot on vegetables. We wanted to see how they would work on strawberry. So this is a planting of strawberry where we used a brush hoe to sweep on either side of the strawberry plants with no cultivation or anything in between the rows, and it does a pretty good job. This is Devernol, which is a standard herbicide that would be used after strawberry planting. You can see there's weeds coming up there because Devernol is a pre-emergent herbicide. It doesn't get all the weeds, but it gets many of them, but not all of them. So compared to the previous picture where you use a cultivation tool, the herbicide doesn't work quite as well. Here's a flex tine harrow. That was the one that drags over top of the plants and vibrates. It doesn't pull the plants out of the ground, but it shakes the weeds loose, and it looks pretty good early in the season. But later in the season, we get a lot of weed seed germination with this flex tine harrow. Because it doesn't bury the weed seeds, it just sort of stirs them up a little bit, even though it takes the weeds out. When you stop using it, then you get a big flush of weeds. And with strawberries, when they start to runner, you can't use the flex tine harrow after that because it'll tear the runners out of the ground. So you have to stop, and you get this big flush of weeds. So by the end of the season, our flex tine harrow plots are fairly weedy. Again, this is a brush hoe after we've gone through early in the season. No herbicides, just a brush hoe. And this is a brush hoe later in the season. So unlike the flex tine harrow, which gave us a big flush of weeds, same plot, same year, the brush hoe kept the weeds at bay. So these cultivation tools, these flex tine harrow, seems to work pretty well. Here's the flex tine harrow. Had lots of weeds in the row and between the row. See the plot. Brush hoe had very few weeds in the row and between the row. So that seems like a pretty promising implement. The herbicide gave us quite a few weeds, so we weren't quite as excited about that. And if you look at yields, it's interesting where we used the multivator, which is the standard implement. Our yields were, kind of on the low side. The flex tine harrow, where we kept the weeds out early, but we had to stop later on, actually the yields are pretty good, even though they were pretty weedy at the end of the year. And again, I think that ties in with what we talked about earlier, that early season weeds, if you get those out of there, you do a pretty good job of having your plants healthy going into the year, and the yields are pretty high. Weeds later on don't matter so much. These plots had weeds later on, but you can see it didn't matter so much. Brush hoe, yes.
Marvin, can I interrupt with one question? Jeff Miller is wondering if there's any research on flamers, like pros and cons. And I'm sorry, I just saw that and I thought I
Yeah.
should
So
ask.
people have played around with flamers, but the thing you don't want to do with a flamer is obviously burn the leaves of the strawberry plant. So you have to focus that between the rows of strawberries. And indeed, it works as long as you have annual plants, or I'm sorry, annual weeds. But if you have perennial weeds, it doesn't do a very good job against them because they come right back. And I really don't know of anyone who is using flamers on strawberries in the planting year. Some people have experimented with a flamer in the fruiting year, like after harvest, to renovate and clean things up, but they seem to damage the plants, and they haven't gotten particularly good results from using the flamers. So I just haven't seen it used. So the brush hoe and the finger weeder were more expensive to use because it's a pretty expensive piece of equipment application. They're much more effective at controlling weeds. And over the long run, the brush hoe is probably cheaper. It's certainly cheaper to use labor-wise than our standard practices because it requires fewer passes, fewer hand weedings, and no herbicide. And if I had a lot of money and I was a strawberry grower, I think a combination of a brush hoe and a Reggie weeder would just be the trick. The brush hoe to sweep the weeds out between the rows, and the Reggie weeder to go along the plants down the row. And I do have a Reggie weeder at home. I haven't gotten a brush hoe, but these implements are quite good because they do control weeds early in the season and they cultivate very shallowly. And the plants really respond to that and seem to grow well. Shift thoughts just a little bit to blueberries, although, and you took this poll, but managing weeds in blueberries is quite a bit easier than it is in strawberries. And the reason for that is because we can plant perennial rye or some type of sort of a grass between the rows of blueberries and our blueberries and then mulch underneath those plants. And we can confine any herbicides to the plants, to that row, that mulched row. And we don't really need a lot because the mulch suppresses a lot of the annual weeds. And then we can just mow the weeds off between the row. And so that works pretty well. And most blueberry growers, if they keep on top of the weeds, don't really have too many troubles. If things get out of hand, they get some vines in there and some trees, but with blueberries, you also have the option with some of those woody perennials of going in early November with some Roundup and spot spraying. It doesn't seem to hurt the blueberries too much as long as you're careful. It can job in their perennial weeds. So blueberries is not too difficult. So the question is, can we take that concept and what works well for blueberries and sort of apply that to a crop like strawberry? In other words, can we think about not doing so much cultivation where we do bring up weed seeds and think of it more of a system where we plant in undisturbed soil like we do here for blueberries and use a lot of mulch. Again, another blueberry field here with fairly clean grass rows, mulch middles. Take this concept to strawberries and see if something might work for them as well. So what we did here is we took various cover crops and we planted those cover crops in the fall. We let them go through the winter, and then the following spring we killed the cover crops. And we did that from different ways. Some of them we had to use Roundup to kill the cover crop. Others we could just mow them and they would die. And others we sprayed paraquat on them because they were annual, and once you killed them, they wouldn't come back. So we had these essentially these dead cover crops in the spring, and then we cultivated narrow strips on these cover crops, and then we planted narrow strips, and we didn't disturb the area in between the rows up weed seeds. And we wanted to suppress weed seed germination. The other thing we did here between the rows is we also came in with some mulch between the rows, and we planted the strawberries at a fairly close density because given the fact that there's undisturbed soil around here, the runners would have a hard time rooting. So instead of asking the plant to make a lot of runners, we just planted the plants closer together, figuring it's cheaper to buy a few more plants than it is to spend a lot of money weeding. So we wanted to see how that would work. And I'm not going to show you data, but I'm going to show you pictures. And here are some strawberry plants planted through a rye cover crop that was killed. The strawberries were planted at fairly close spacing in a narrow strip, and then we came in with a little bit of straw mulch and put over top of that killed rye. So there was rye, plus there was a little bit of rye straw added to give a little bit more biomass. This is in a really weedy field, a lot of nutsedge, and those of you who are familiar with nutsedge know that it's just a terrible weed. It's very aggressive, and it pushes up through plastic and everything. But if you see where the arrows are here, these plots had no herbicide, and all they had was killed rye with straw mulch over top of it, and the plants are at a relatively high density, and they did extremely well, at least in terms of keeping the weeds down. So this system here, I think, has some promise, especially on lighter soils where you can get in and get those strawberries into the ground at a higher density. So how did I get in there? Okay. So I wanted to show you, this is a, a row, a conventional planting that we use herbicides and everything like that on. And this is with the mulches. And the weeds are pretty good in both cases. So these high density plantings with the sod mulch work, I think, pretty well, or at least equivalent to what the standard way of growing strawberries. Now we can apply that same principle to raspberries. We have some good data to show that raspberries really thrive in the straw mulch in the planting year. Not in subsequent years, but in the planting year, raspberries like to be surrounded by mulch, just like I showed you for those strawberries. So this would be a typical way we might recommend growers plant raspberries. You know, 2 or 3 feet apart down the row with trickle irrigation and straw mulch around the plants because I love that straw mulch.
Marvin, could I
Yeah,
interrupt too, just quickly? We have another question about using oats as a cover crop and whether or not you could also use a roller crimper on the rye, and maybe you will be talking about that.
yeah, I'll try to get to both of those questions in the next couple minutes. So we haven't tried crimping the rye, uh, but we have treated it with paraquat or Roundup because that way we pick up a few extra weeds along the way. But I think you probably could crimp the rye as long as you're doing it at the right stage where it kills it. What we did in this experiment was we wanted to see if we could grow the mulch in place when we planted the raspberries so that we wouldn't have to bring the straw in. So here's a plot. So you can see some of these plots here where we had, bare ground, and we had rye. And then we planted the raspberries down the rows here to see how they would do. And here are the little raspberry plants growing between that killed rye. And then we followed them for a couple of years. And it's interesting, this photo here was taken 2 years after the rye was planted. And and here are the control plots where we had that bare ground, and here are the plots where we had the rye. And even though everything was treated exactly the same in those two plots, you can see big differences between where we had the rye here and where we didn't have the rye here. It's really remarkable. So that planting through that rye residue had a really big impact on the raspberries. No difference in yield, but the weed pressure was certainly greater where we did not use the rye. So it was, I thought, pretty dramatic. Now back to Jeff's question about could you also use some sort of a oat cover crop? Well, now oats die in the wintertime. So if you plant rye, or if you plant oats in the winter, or I'm sorry, in the fall and let them go through the winter, by the time spring comes around, there's not a lot of residue there. You could plant through it, but it's not a lot of residue. I'm not sure if it would be enough to really suppress weeds, whereas rye gives you more residue and is allelopathic and suppresses weeds. What we have done with oats, what we have done with Sudan grass, is after renovating strawberries, we've gone in and just broadcast the seed over top of the strawberry field. So instead of going through and having bare soil from, say, August through October, again, more opportunities for weeds to germinate. The idea was, why not sow a seed in there of at least a plant that we know is going to die in the wintertime and not going to go to seed. So we over broadcast the oats, we broadcast the Sudan grass. They grow, they displace the weeds that normally would grow, and then they die in the winter and leave us with a residue between the strawberry plants, but no weeds. And it looks pretty trashy in the fall when you do that after the frost comes, but it does a pretty good job of keeping the weeds out as well. So those are some of the approaches we've used to trying to manage weeds in strawberries. Again, this is the strawberry field in the spring after we grew the Sudan grass between the rows of strawberries, and it looks pretty clean. So here's some sort of new ways that we're thinking about managing weeds without relying on herbicides all the time, using cover crops to reduce weed pressure before planting, focus our attention early in the season. If you have limited time, focus it early rather than late. Some options are planting through killed sods, using shallow cultivation tools, and then interplanting cover crops. And that may hold some promise as opposed to going in there with Sinbar or something like that after renovation. So with that, Laura, I think we're done with the formal presentation, and maybe we can go and look at some of the responses to the poll or answer some questions. And Jeff asks, what's the
Okay, that
timing of sowing the oats of Sudan grass? We plant or seed that right at renovation, so that would be probably early August after you go through with the rototiller and narrow up the rows. The leaves are mowed off, you narrow up the rows. Then you can seed your oats and Sudan grass then. If it's a really hot, warm summer late at the end of the season, the Sudan grass can grow pretty tall. So when we've done that, we've had pretty good results just to go in with like a sickle bar or something and mow that Sudan grass back down to say a foot high if it exceeds the strawberry plants by too much. In other words, it'll shade the strawberry plants out if it gets too tall. So we don't let it get too tall. But if we just go in and mow it, that's a good way of setting it back again and having it sort of start over again and still provide that biomass that we want later in the season.
All right, does anybody else have any questions? Now's your chance. Okay, maybe we can look at the results of the poll. Try to find the one that, well, we'll just start with this one. And this is, let me just see if I guess the results there. Hopefully you're seeing the results. And
That was the one where
neither
you could
is we.
only choose
Oh yeah,
one,
this was the one that we couldn't. Yeah, this isn't very
so
appropriate.
it's
So
probably not very
let's
useful.
get rid of this one. Let's look at what type of. Let me just broadcast the results and what type of new herbicide would be most useful to strawberry growers. And I don't know if you want to comment at all on that, Marvin.
Yeah, I would say that I would agree that post-emergent broadleaf is probably most valuable. It's not too difficult to kill grass in strawberries because grass is a monocot and it's a grass, and you can find selective herbicides against grasses that leave the strawberries alone. But where you have real difficulty are broadleaf weeds within a broadleaf plant. Most of the broadleaf herbicides that are out there affect strawberries as well. One of the few that doesn't is 2,4-D, surprisingly. 2,4-D will impact most other broadleaf plants and leave strawberries alone. It's a very old herbicide. Growers have used it for years, and it's still really quite a good herbicide to use on strawberries, particularly at renovation time and again in early November when it's still a little warm and the dandelions and plants like that can take it up. But yeah, anything that works on broadleaf plants that selectively leave strawberries alone would be a good thing.
All right, as I switch these poll things, there's a couple of other questions, Marvin. One from Jeff Miller about can cover crops be a host of pests of strawberries? And then Jan Beglinger has a question as well.
Yeah, so cover crops can be hosts of pests, but if you select a cover crop that's not closely related to the crop, then the odds of sharing pests diminish considerably. And that's why most of the cover crops that we've talked about are grass type crops in the grass family. So Sudan grass, it doesn't really share any pests of strawberries. In fact, it helps suppress nematodes. Rye, oats, those things, they do not share pests with strawberries, so they're very safe to use. Whereas if we would be using, say, like a legume cover crop, like clover or peas, they do harbor lots of diseases in common with strawberries because they're much more closely related. Verticillium wilt, tarnished plant bug, things like that. So stick with the grasses and you'll be much safer. And then in terms of fact sheets, we have good information in the production guides, the strawberry production guide, the blueberry guide, the raspberry guide. They all have a chapter in there, a section on cover crops that are appropriate to use in the various berry crops.
What percent of non-harvest labor expenditures do you believe growers spend on weed management and
Yeah, we've done various economic analyses, and in fact, the last 2 weeks I've taken my class on field trips to strawberry farms, and we've asked the growers that question specifically, and they all say about 80%. And our numbers, when we look at it, the economics, it looks like it's about 70%. So it's very, very high. A lot of labor is spent pulling weeds and managing weeds in strawberries in particular. That's why we're focusing so many of our efforts on strawberries.
Okay, let's look at these polls about how effective the current suite of for herbicides, strawberries,
And
raspberries. and blueberries. And let me just make sure that they're all, broadcast the results of all of these as we look at them.
And I would, you know, concur with these results. At least that's how I would expect them to come out, even if you polled a bunch of growers that, strawberry herbicides are moderately effective. There are more now than there were just a few years ago. Same with raspberries, moderately effective. None are super effective. But blueberries, we have a few that are, fairly effective on blueberries because we have a plant that's up higher. It has woody stems and shoots, so it gives us a lot more options for spraying a little bit more harsher product down on the ground and not affecting the plant.
All right, and for our final question, this was actually the first question, broadcast those results.
And again, I think people's perception is right. Strawberry growers struggle the most with weeds compared to the other two. And then I see a few questions down here that we can maybe answer about cover crops. The SARE Managing Cover Crops book is a good resource, and it sure is. A lot of the information from the SARE guide, we've picked out cover crops that would be in that SARE book for the production guide because certain ones don't do well. Like it's in the SARE book, like some of the legumes, but in a blueberry field where you have an acidic soil, the legumes don't grow well in acidic soil. So those would be excluded even though they might be good cover crops otherwise. So if you look in a blueberry production guide, it won't talk about leguminous cover crops because it's just not compatible with the acidic soil. And the question that Dean asked, can buckwheat be used as a late cover at renovation or other pest concerns? The problem that we've seen with buckwheat is that it throws a good bit of shade and it also goes to seed and the and you might have to kill it or cultivate it before it goes to seed. Whereas the oats and the Sudan grass, we don't have to worry about that. We let the frost take care of it for us and we can just leave it in place. If you use buckwheat in between the rows, you'd have to manage it a little bit more carefully because you wouldn't want it to turn into a weed for you the following year. I'm not sure about pest concerns with buckwheat. I don't think there would be pest concerns. Particularly, when it's flowering after strawberries flower. So even if it would attract tarnished plant bugs or something like that, it would be past the point at which strawberries are vulnerable. And then I see Jeff is asking about sap beetle. I'm not sure in what context, but sap beetles do overwinter can overwinter in strawberry fields if there's a lot of junk around. So there could be an issue, I suppose, if you had a lot of residue, it can make an environment a little bit more favorable for the sap beetle to overwinter in. So instead of leaving the field into the woods and all, it might just hang around. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't had anybody say or observe any growers say, I've been mulching more and I've been using these interplanted cover crops and I just noticed my sap beetle increasing dramatically. I haven't heard that, but I think theoretically it's possible.
All right, does anybody else have any questions for Marvin? I do want to let you know that we have another webcast training on October 8th at 1 o'clock again. It'll be the same format, but a different topic. I believe that one is with Dr. Courtney Weber about new small fruit varieties. And I am hopeful that I'm going to be able to email you folks a couple of questions just about the format and whether or not the thing went smoothly, the whole webcast went smoothly. And if you wanted to make any suggestions, please don't hesitate to email me. And I appreciate you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pritts, for participating. And thanks to the rest of you for joining
Yeah,
us.
thank you very
And we'll
much.
see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.